In the scorching badlands of New Mexico Territory, where mercy was often rewarded with a bullet and kindness could ignite a war, one woman's split-second decision would bind her fate to a people she barely understood. Louisa Pemberton thought she was simply saving a dying child when she put her lips to a festering wound and drew out scorpion venom with her own mouth. She had no idea that this single act of desperate compassion would make her the center of a blood debt, a territorial conflict, and an offer of marriage from the most feared Apache war chief in the Southwest. The August sun hung over the Mimbres Valley like a furnace door left open to hell, baking the alkali flats into a cracked white crust that burned through boot leather and turned the horizon into a shimmering lie. For Louisa Pemberton, this unforgiving wilderness was both laboratory and classroom, a place where the practical science of frontier medicine collided daily with the brutal reality of survival. Her canvas field bag, stained with rust-colored dust and the dark residue of 100 emergencies, hung heavy across her shoulder as she made her way through a scattered grove of juniper trees, their twisted trunks offering precious little shade. She had arrived in New Mexico Territory 8 months earlier, fleeing the suffocating propriety of Philadelphia's medical establishment, where women were tolerated as nurses but forbidden from the actual practice of medicine. Her father, a prominent surgeon, had wanted her to marry well and host dinner parties for his colleagues. Instead, she had taken the medical knowledge he had reluctantly taught her and headed west to Fort Bayard, where the army surgeon was desperate enough for help that he didn't care about her gender. The fort's commanding officer had been scandalized. The officers' wives had shunned her. But the endless stream of injured soldiers, sick children, and ailing settlers didn't discriminate based on social convention. Her small adobe quarters attached to the fort's hospital had become her sanctuary, filled with medical texts, bottles of tinctures, and the tools of her trade. The people of nearby Silver City called her peculiar, a spinster with dangerous ideas, but their opinions dissolved like morning frost when their children ran fever or their husbands took bullets in mining disputes. Out here, 3 days' ride from anything resembling civilization, results mattered more than reputation. At least, that's what she told herself on the lonely nights when the coyotes sang and the wind carried sounds that might have been Apache war cries. Today, she had ventured beyond the fort's protective perimeter, against every piece of advice she had received. A Mexican settler family 5 miles south had sent word that their youngest daughter was burning with fever, possibly typhoid, and Louisa had set out at first light with her medical bag and a borrowed army horse. The visit had taken longer than expected. The girl didn't have typhoid, but rather a severe case of measles, complicated by dehydration. And Louisa had spent hours getting fluids into the child and instructing the terrified mother on continued care. Now, riding back toward the fort as afternoon stretched toward evening, she was acutely aware that she was alone in territory where the Apache had been raiding with increasing frequency. The recent campaigns by the army had pushed several bands into the mountains, and desperation made men dangerous. She kept her horse at a steady pace, her eyes scanning the rock formations and arroyos, where an entire war party could hide in plain sight. The Springfield rifle the fort commander had insisted she carry rested across her saddle, though she had no illusions about her ability to fight off an attack. Her best defense was speed and the hope that she was too insignificant a target to bother with. The sound that stopped her was so faint she almost missed it beneath the rhythmic clop of her horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the sparse grass. A whimper, thin and weak like an animal in pain. Her horse's ears swiveled forward, catching something her human senses had nearly overlooked. Every instinct screamed at her to keep riding, to make it back to the fort before sunset painted targets on every moving thing. This was Apache country, and sounds in the wilderness were often traps, lures to draw foolish travelers into ambush, but the sound came again, and this time she recognized it unmistakably as a child's cry, broken and desperate. Louisa reined in her horse, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sat frozen in the saddle, torn between self-preservation and the oath she had taken, the fundamental commitment to healing that had driven her west in the first place. A child was hurt, possibly dying, and everything she had learned, everything she believed about the value of human life, demanded that she investigate. She dismounted slowly, tying her horse to a sturdy juniper branch and taking only her medical bag and a canteen. The rifle she left in its saddle holster, a calculated decision. If this was an ambush, the weapon would do her no good anyway. If it was truly a child in need, arriving armed might get her killed faster than approaching empty-handed. She moved toward the sound, her footsteps careful on the loose shale that could turn an ankle or announce her presence with a clatter. Hati! She found him wedged between two massive boulders at the base of a weathered mesa, partially hidden by the sparse shadow of an overhanging rock. An Apache boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, his copper skin slick with sweat and his small body curled in a position of agony. He wore simple deerskin leggings and a breechcloth, his long black hair matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. A fall, she assessed immediately. The scrapes on his arms and the way he favored his left side suggested he had tumbled from somewhere above, probably while climbing. But it was his right hand that made her breath catch in her throat. The limb was grotesquely swollen, nearly twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and mottled with angry shades of purple and red. At the base of his thumb, she could see 2 small puncture marks, slightly blackened at the edges. Bark scorpion, her mind supplied instantly. Centruroides sculpturatus, the most venomous scorpion species in North America, capable of killing a child within hours if the sting wasn't treated. The boy's eyes fluttered open as she approached, glassy with fever and pain. When he saw her, his pale face and strange clothing, terror flooded his features. He tried to scramble backward, but the movement sent a wave of nausea through him, visible in the way his body convulsed. He made a sound, a word in Apache she didn't understand, probably a plea or a curse. His good hand fumbled weakly for something at his belt, a small knife, but his coordination was destroyed by the venom and fever. Louisa held up both hands, palms out, in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. Her throat was dry, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. She cleared it and tried again, speaking slowly and softly, the way she might approach a terrified animal. The words didn't matter as much as the tone, she hoped. A calm steadiness that might penetrate the boy's delirium. She knelt slowly, maintaining eye contact, and pointed to his swollen hand, then to her medical bag, then back to his hand. She made a gesture of drinking water, of cooling, of helping. The boy watched her with wide, dark eyes that flickered between suspicion and desperate hope. He was dying, and some part of his fevered mind must have understood that this strange white woman might be his only chance. Louisa set her bag down and opened it with deliberate slowness, pulling out items one at a time so he could see that none of them were weapons. A roll of clean bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid for disinfection, a small jar of laudanum for pain, and finally her folding medical knife, which made the boy flinch violently. She set it down between them, not touching it, letting him see it wasn't a threat. The venom was already well advanced into his system. She could see the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the way his pupils were dilated unevenly, the slight tremor in his muscles that suggested the neurotoxins were affecting his nervous system. In a hospital, she would have had ice to reduce the swelling, possibly even anti-venom serum, though that was still experimental and rarely available. Here, in the middle of nowhere, she had exactly one option, and it was dangerous, possibly futile. But it was all she had. She had to extract the venom, and she had to do it now, before it spread any further. The method was controversial, taught to her by an old frontier doctor who had learned it from Mexican healers. Make a small incision over the sting site to open the wound, then use suction to draw out as much venom as possible before it entered the deeper bloodstream. The risk was infection, The risk was that she might make things worse, but doing nothing guaranteed the boy's death. Louisa looked into his eyes, those dark pools of pain and fear, and spoke softly in English, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he would understand the intent. She touched her chest, then reached out slowly to touch his uninjured shoulder, a connection, a promise. Then she picked up the medical knife. The boy tensed, his body going rigid, but he didn't pull away. Perhaps he was too weak. Perhaps in his delirium he understood that this was help, not harm. Louisa worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She cleaned the area around the sting with carbolic acid, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the desert air. The boy hissed in pain but held still. With a quick, precise movement, she made a small X-shaped incision directly over the 2 puncture marks, just deep enough to break through the surface layers of skin. Dark blood welled up immediately, mixed with the yellowish tint of venom. The boy cried out, a high, keening sound that tore at her heart, but she couldn't stop now. She set down the knife and immediately brought her mouth to the wound. The taste was metallic and bitter, the blood warm and the venom carrying a strange, acrid quality that made her tongue tingle unpleasantly. She created suction, drawing the contaminated blood into her mouth, then turned and spat forcefully into the sand beside them. Again and again, she repeated the process, sucking and spitting, her lips sealed around the small wound, pulling out as much of the poison as she could reach. The venom couldn't harm her through her mouth's mucous membranes unless she had open sores, and she was careful not to swallow. Each mouthful of blood and poison she expelled into the dust, creating a small dark stain on the pale sand. The boy had gone very still, his breathing ragged, his eyes half closed. Whether from shock or simply exhaustion, she couldn't tell. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, she stopped, satisfied that she had removed as much venom as was possible through this method. She rinsed her mouth thoroughly with water from her canteen, spitting repeatedly to clear any residual toxins, then turned her attention back to her patient. She prepared a poultice from dried plantain leaves she kept in her bag, crushing them and mixing them with a small amount of water to create a thick green paste. This she packed carefully over the incision, covering the sting site. The plantain would help draw out any remaining poison and reduce inflammation. She wrapped the entire hand in clean bandages, not too tight, leaving room for the swelling but keeping the poultice in place. Next she addressed the various scrapes and cuts from his fall, cleaning them with carbolic solution and binding the worst of them. A nasty gash on his shin required several stitches, which she did as gently as possible while the boy drifted in and out of consciousness. She checked his ribs carefully, feeling for breaks, and was relieved to find only bruising. Finally, she managed to get a few drops of laudanum-laced water between his cracked lips, enough to ease his pain without dangerously depressing his breathing. As she worked, the sun continued its descent, painting the western sky in shades of orange and crimson. Louisa looked around at the empty landscape, at the gathering shadows, and faced a decision that would alter the course of her life. She couldn't leave him here. The night would bring cold that could kill him in his weakened state, and predators, both animal and human, that would find him easy prey. But bringing him with her was its own kind of danger. If she brought him to the fort, the soldiers would see him as an enemy, possibly even a source of intelligence about Apache positions. They might imprison him, or worse. The boy would be terrified, and any chance of his people recovering him peacefully would evaporate in the politics and prejudices of the fort. On the other hand, if she tried to find his people to return him, she would be riding directly into Apache territory, and they would have every reason to kill her on sight. There was a third option, one that made her pulse quicken with fear, but seemed like the only humane choice. Her quarters at the fort had a separate entrance, a small room that had originally been used for storage. If she could get him there without being seen, she could tend to him properly, give him time to recover, and then figure out how to safely return him to his people. It was risky, possibly suicidal if discovered, but it was the only path that didn't end with this child's death or imprisonment. The boy was unconscious now, his breathing more regular but still shallow. The laudanum had taken effect. Louisa made her decision. She carefully lifted him, surprised by how solid and heavy he was, despite his small frame. He was dead weight in her arms, his head lolling against her shoulder. She carried him back to where her horse waited, the animal's ears flicking nervously at the unfamiliar burden. Getting him onto the horse was a challenge. She finally managed to drape him across the saddle in front of her, holding him in place with one arm while managing the reins with the other. It was awkward and precarious, but it would have to work. She urged the horse forward, moving as quickly as she dared while keeping the boy from sliding off. The ride back to Fort Bayard was the longest of her life. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made her heart race. The boy remained unconscious, his fevered body warm against hers, his breathing a constant reminder of the fragile life she was trying to save. As the fort's wooden palisade came into view against the darkening sky, she felt no relief, only a new kind of fear. Now came the truly dangerous part. She approached from the east side, where her quarters were located, timing her arrival for the changing of the guard when attention would be divided. Most of the soldiers would be at evening mess, and the sentries would be focused on the perimeter, not the interior. She dismounted behind her small adobe building, hidden from view by a storage shed, and carefully lifted the boy down. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door to her quarters and carried him inside, laying him on the narrow cot in the storage room. She lit a single lamp, keeping the flame low, and pulled the shutters closed. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, to acknowledge the magnitude of what she had just done. She had brought an Apache child into an army fort, hidden him in her quarters, and committed what would likely be considered treason, or at minimum gross insubordination. But as she looked down at his small, still form, at the careful bandages she had applied, and the slight rise and fall of his chest, she felt no regret. She had saved a life. Everything else was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight she would keep vigil, monitoring his fever, checking his breathing, and praying that her desperate act of mercy wouldn't end with both of them dead. The first night was a descent into uncertainty and fear that no medical training could have prepared Louisa for. She sat on a wooden stool beside the cot, monitoring Taza's vital signs by lamplight, acutely aware that every creak of the floorboards outside, every footstep passing her door, could mean discovery and disaster. The boy's fever climbed as the hours crawled past, his small body burning with a heat that seemed impossible for something so fragile to contain. She changed the cool compresses on his forehead every 15 minutes, wringing out cloths in a basin of precious water she had fetched earlier under the pretense of washing her medical instruments. Around midnight, Taza began to convulse. His back arched off the cot, his limbs jerking in violent spasms that sent terror flooding through Louisa's chest. This was a known complication of bark scorpion envenomation, the neurotoxins causing uncontrolled muscle contractions that could break bones or stop the heart. She forced a leather strap between his teeth to keep him from biting through his tongue, held his thrashing body as still as she could, and waited for the seizure to pass. It lasted less than a minute but felt like an eternity, each second a countdown to potential death. When the convulsions finally subsided, leaving him limp and gasping, she administered another careful dose of laudanum, balancing the need to calm his nervous system against the danger of respiratory depression. She had walked this tightrope 100 times with wounded soldiers, but never had the stakes felt so personal, so weighted with consequences that extended far beyond one life. If this child died in her quarters, she would have to explain not just a medical failure, but an act of profound political stupidity. If he lived, she would have to figure out how to return him to people who had every reason to slit her throat on sight. Dawn brought no relief, only a change in the quality of her anxiety. The fort began to stir around her, the sounds of men drilling in the parade ground, horses being led to water, the general cacophony of military life seeping through her walls. She had to appear at the hospital for her regular duties or risk questions she couldn't answer. Captain Edwards, the post surgeon, was a decent man but hidebound by army regulations and a deep suspicion of the Apache. If he discovered what she had done, he would have no choice but to report her to the commanding officer. She checked Taza one final time before leaving. His fever had broken slightly, dropping from the dangerous heights of the night before to something merely alarming. The swelling in his hand had diminished noticeably, the angry purple fading to a mottled yellow and green that suggested the venom was being processed and expelled by his young body. The poultice had done its work, and her desperate act of sucking out the poison had apparently removed enough of the initial dose to give his system a fighting chance. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was deeper, more regular, and when she checked his pulse it was strong and steady. She left food and water within reach in case he woke, though she prayed he would remain asleep until she could return. The storage room door she locked from the outside, pocketing the key. If anyone asked, she would say she was storing sensitive medical supplies that needed to be secured. It was thin as explanations went, but it would have to suffice. The morning at the hospital passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt surreal, given the secret she was harboring. She changed dressings on a private who had been kicked by a mule, administered quinine to 2 soldiers suffering from malaria, and listened to Captain Edwards complain about the inadequacy of their medical supplies and the foolishness of the fort's commander in provoking the Apache with aggressive patrols. She nodded in the right places, made appropriate sounds of agreement, and all the while her mind was racing through scenarios of discovery and disaster. It was nearly noon when Lieutenant Morrison appeared in the hospital doorway, his face flushed with excitement and something darker. Morrison was young, ambitious, and carried the casual racism of his upbringing like a badge of honor. He had made it clear on several occasions that he considered Louisa's presence at the fort to be an amusing novelty at best and a dangerous distraction at worst. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone who enjoyed wielding power, "the commander wants to see you in his office, immediately." Her heart dropped into her stomach. She forced her face to remain neutral, her voice steady. "May I ask what this concerns, Lieutenant?" Morrison's smile was unpleasant. "Seems there was an Apache sighting yesterday, not far from where you were treating that Mexican family. Some of the scouts found tracks this morning. The commander wants to know if you saw anything unusual during your ride back." Relief washed over her so powerfully she had to grip the edge of the examination table to keep her knees from buckling. They didn't know about Taza. This was just routine questioning, the kind of intelligence gathering that happened constantly in the uneasy dance between the fort and the Apache bands that controlled the surrounding territory. She could handle this. Commander Blackwell's office was a study in military austerity. All hard edges and functional furniture, maps of the territory covering every wall, with red pins marking the locations of known Apache encampments and recent raids. Blackwell himself was a career soldier in his 50s, his face weathered by decades of frontier service, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of a man who had seen too much violence to take pleasure in it anymore. "Miss Pemberton," he said without preamble as she entered, "I understand you were 5 miles south of the fort yesterday, unescorted." That was foolish. She bristled at the paternalistic tone, but kept her voice professional. "A child was sick, Commander. The family sent word. I'm a medical professional. I go where I'm needed," Blackwell grunted, neither approval nor disapproval, just acknowledgement. "Did you see any signs of Apache activity during your travel? Smoke signals, fresh tracks, anything that seemed out of place?" Louisa's mind raced. A lie would be safest, a simple denial that would end this conversation and let her return to her hidden patient. But lies had a way of unraveling, especially in a place as small and gossip-ridden as the fort. A partial truth might serve her better. "I heard something," she said carefully. In the rocks near Massacre Mesa. It sounded like a child crying, but I didn't investigate. I assumed it was an animal and kept riding. Given the stories about Apache tactics, I thought it wiser not to take the bait. The commander nodded approvingly. Good instincts. There's been an increase in scouting activity in that area. We think they're watching the southern approaches, possibly planning something. I'm restricting all civilian movement beyond the fort perimeter until further notice. That includes you, Miss Pemberton. If people need medical attention, they can come here. It was an order, not a suggestion, and Louisa knew better than to argue. She simply nodded, accepting the restriction, even as her mind catalogued the new complications this created. If she couldn't leave the fort, how would she return Taza to his people when the time came? She was dismissed and returned to the hospital, where Captain Edwards immediately put her to work, inventorying their dwindling supply of morphine and surgical thread. It was tedious work that required enough attention to prevent mistakes, but not enough to stop her mind from spinning through possibilities and problems. By mid-afternoon, she was nearly vibrating with the need to check on her patient, but she forced herself to wait until the shift change, when the hospital would be briefly empty. She slipped away during the chaos of the dinner hour, when most of the fort's population was crowded into the mess hall. The walk across the parade ground to her quarters felt like a mile, every window a potential witness, every shadow a threat. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, her heart pounding. The storage room was as she had left it, the lamp extinguished to prevent suspicion, the shutters closed tight. She relit the lamp with trembling hands and turned to the cot. Taza's eyes were open, watching her with an intensity that made her freeze. He was awake, fully conscious and terrified. His good hand clutched the knife he must have retrieved from his belongings. The blade pointed at her with surprising steadiness for a child who had been unconscious for nearly 24 hours. Louisa slowly raised her hands, palms out, the same gesture of peace she had offered in the desert. She spoke softly, calmly, using the few Apache words she had picked up from friendly scouts over the months. "Friend," she said, mangling the pronunciation but hoping the intent was clear. "Medicine, help." Taza's eyes darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the whitewashed adobe walls, the medical supplies on the shelf, the locked door. He said something in rapid Apache, his voice weak but fierce, a string of words that needed no translation. He was demanding to know where he was, who she was, what she wanted. She pointed to his bandaged hand, then made a motion of drinking, then pointed to food and water she had left for him. His eyes followed her gestures, but the knife didn't waver. He was trapped in an enemy fort, held by a stranger, and every survival instinct was screaming at him to fight or flee. The problem was that he could do neither. He was still too weak, and any attempt to escape would get him killed by the first soldier who spotted him. Louisa made a decision. She turned her back on him deliberately, showing trust, showing that she wasn't a threat. She busied herself at the small table, preparing a simple meal from her own rations, bread and dried meat, and a precious apple she had been saving. She filled a cup with clean water and added a small amount of honey for energy. Then, moving slowly, she brought these offerings to the cot and set them within his reach before backing away to give him space. For a long moment, Taza just stared at the food, suspicion and hunger warring in his young face. His stomach made the decision for him, growling audibly in the quiet room. He lowered the knife slightly, keeping it in his lap but no longer actively threatening, and reached for the bread with his good hand. He ate like someone starving, tearing into the food with the single-minded focus of a survivor. While he ate, Louisa slowly approached again, pointing to his bandaged hand and making a questioning gesture. He hesitated, then extended the injured limb reluctantly. She unwrapped the bandages with gentle efficiency, pleased to see that the swelling had continued to decrease and the sting site showed no signs of infection. The incision she had made was healing cleanly. She applied fresh poultice and clean bandages while he watched her warily, still clutching the knife in his other hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When she finished, she sat back on her stool and met his eyes. For the first time, she really looked at him not as a patient, but as a person. He had his father's strong features, she would later learn, the high cheekbones and proud bearing that marked the children of leaders even in their youth. His hair, once cleaned of dust and blood, would be glossy black, and his eyes held an intelligence and awareness far beyond his years. This was not just any Apache child. This was someone important. She pulled out a small pad of paper and a pencil, thinking to try to communicate through drawings. She sketched a simple house, then a cross to indicate medicine, then a figure that was meant to represent him. She drew herself standing next to him, and between them she drew a heart. It was crude, almost childish, but the message was clear. She was trying to help. She meant no harm. She wanted him to get well. Taza studied the drawing, his expression unreadable. Then with his good hand, he took the pencil from her. His grip was awkward, the implement clearly foreign to him, but he managed to draw something on the paper. It was a mesa, distinctive in its shape, with a symbol at its base that might have been a dwelling or a clan sign. He pointed to it, then to himself, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to indicate distance. He was telling her where he came from, or perhaps where his people were camped. It was information that could get his entire band killed if Louisa shared it with the fort's commanders. But instead of taking the paper to Blackwell, she carefully tore it from the pad and handed it back to Taza. He looked surprised, then something like respect flickered in his dark eyes. She had been given intelligence about Apache positions and had chosen to give it back. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any shared language could. Over the next 2 days, an uneasy routine developed. Louisa would spend her days at the hospital, maintaining the facade of normalcy, then return to her quarters in the evening to tend to Taza. She brought him food stolen from her own rations, changed his bandages, and slowly, haltingly, they began to find ways to communicate. He taught her Apache words, pointing to objects and saying their names. She taught him English in return, though he seemed less interested in her language than she was in his. She learned that his name meant morning in his language, that he was the son of someone important, though she couldn't quite grasp whether it was a war chief or a shaman from his attempted explanations. She learned that he had been hunting alone, practicing his skills away from the watchful eyes of his elders when he had climbed too high on the mesa wall and fallen. The scorpion had been waiting in the rocks where he landed, defensive and deadly. He learned that she was a healer, that she lived alone, that the soldiers in the fort were not her friends, but rather employers she tolerated out of necessity. She showed him her medical texts, the detailed drawings of human anatomy that fascinated and disturbed him in equal measure. She demonstrated how to properly clean and dress a wound, letting him practice on a rolled-up piece of cloth. He was a quick learner, his hands already steady and sure despite his youth. On the third night, everything changed. Louisa was checking his healing hand by lamplight when she heard voices outside her quarters, loud and aggressive. Lieutenant Morrison's voice was unmistakable, arguing with someone about search procedures. Her blood turned to ice. Someone had reported something suspicious, and Morrison was using it as an excuse to investigate. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he knocked on her door. She looked at Taza, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. There was no time to hide him, no time to plan. If Morrison searched her quarters and found an Apache child, she would be arrested, and Taza would be imprisoned or killed. The voices were getting closer, boots on the packed earth outside. Louisa made the only decision she could. She blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and positioned herself between the storage room door and the main entrance. If they came in, they would have to go through her first. The knock came, sharp and impatient. Morrison's voice called out, "Miss Pemberton, open this door. We have reports of unusual activity in this section of the fort. I'm authorized to conduct a search." Louisa took a deep breath, steadied her voice, and called back, "One moment, Lieutenant. I'm not properly dressed." She bought herself a few more seconds, using them to silently motion Taza to stay absolutely quiet and still. Then she opened the door, blocking the entrance with her body. Morrison stood there with 2 enlisted men, all 3 carrying rifles. His expression was smug, the look of a man who thought he had finally caught someone in wrongdoing. "We've had reports of lights at odd hours, strange sounds from your quarters. I need to search the premises." Louisa drew herself up to her full height, channeling every ounce of Philadelphia aristocratic indignation she possessed. "Reports from whom, Lieutenant? I'm a medical professional who keeps irregular hours due to the nature of my work. If someone finds that suspicious, perhaps they should reconsider their own paranoia. As for searching my private quarters, I believe you need authorization from Commander Blackwell for that, not just your own curiosity." Morrison's face reddened. He hadn't expected her to push back, and she had called his bluff about authorization. He glanced at his men, clearly trying to decide whether to force the issue. "I'm acting on concerns about fort security," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then take those concerns to the commander in the morning," Louisa said firmly. "It's late, I'm tired, and unless you have a direct order signed by Commander Blackwell, I'm going to have to insist you respect my privacy. I'm sure the commander would be very interested to hear about officers harassing civilian personnel without proper cause." It was a calculated risk, invoking Blackwell's authority. Morrison hated her, but he was also ambitious, and a formal complaint could damage his career. He stood there for a long moment, clearly torn, then spun on his heel. "This isn't over, Miss Pemberton. I know you're hiding something, and I will find out what it is." He stalked off into the night, his men following, and Louisa closed the door with shaking hands. She leaned against the door, her heart racing, and allowed herself a moment of pure terror. That had been too close. Morrison was suspicious now, actively looking for evidence against her. She couldn't keep Taza hidden much longer without the risk of discovery becoming a certainty. She needed a plan, and she needed it soon. She relit the lamp and returned to the storage room, where Taza sat on the cot, his knife once again in his hand, but this time pointed toward where the voices had come from. He had been ready to fight if they came through the door, this small, wounded child, prepared to defend himself and possibly her against armed soldiers. The realization of his courage and her own recklessness hit her simultaneously. "We can't stay like this," she said, knowing he couldn't understand most of the words, but needing to say them anyway. "I have to find a way to get you home before we both end up dead." Taza looked at her, and for the first time he spoke in halting English. 3 words he must have been practicing. "You good person," he said. "The solution came from an unexpected source." Maria Delgado was a laundress who worked at the fort, a widow whose husband had been killed in a skirmish with Comancheros 3 years prior. She was one of the few people at Fort Bayard who had ever shown Louisa genuine kindness, sometimes leaving fresh tortillas wrapped in cloth outside her door, other times simply offering a smile when the loneliness of frontier life threatened to overwhelm. Maria moved through the fort like a ghost, invisible to most of the soldiers, noticed only when their uniforms weren't clean enough or their sheets weren't changed promptly. It was Maria who knocked softly on Louisa's door 2 days after Morrison's attempted search, her weathered face creased with concern. Louisa opened the door cautiously, her body blocking the view into her quarters, but Maria simply held up a basket of clean linens and spoke in rapid Spanish. "I know you're hiding something, señorita. The whole fort whispers about strange sounds from your room. Morrison, he watches your door like a hawk watches a rabbit. Whatever you are doing, it is dangerous." Louisa's throat went dry. She started to form a denial, but Maria cut her off with a shake of her head. "I do not ask what or who, but I tell you this, if Morrison catches you, he will not show mercy. He hates you already, and he hates the Apache more. Whatever is in your room, it must leave soon, or you will both die." She pressed the basket into Louisa's hands and turned to go, then paused. "There is a supply wagon leaving tomorrow at dawn for Silver City. The driver, Roberto, he is my cousin. He owes me favors. The wagon will stop at the old mission ruins 2 miles south. If something needs to disappear from the fort, that would be a good time." Before Louisa could respond, Maria had slipped away, her words hanging in the air like smoke. Louisa closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. Maria knew, or at least suspected, and instead of reporting her, she had offered a lifeline. It was a staggering act of trust and solidarity, one that could get Maria hanged as an accomplice if things went wrong. But it was also the answer to a problem Louisa had been unable to solve. She had a way to get Taza out of the fort. She returned to the storage room, where Taza sat cross-legged on the floor, practicing his English by sounding out words from one of her medical texts. His hand was almost completely healed now, only a faint discoloration remaining where the scorpion had stung him. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes questioning. Over the past days, they had developed a strange partnership. Teacher and student, patient and healer, two people from utterly different worlds, forced into an alliance by circumstance. "Tomorrow," Louisa said slowly, using a mixture of English and the Apache words she had learned. "You go home, back to your people." She made a gesture toward the window, toward the mountains beyond. Taza's expression shifted through several emotions, relief and fear, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "You come?" he asked in his careful English. "Take me to father?" Louisa hesitated. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to get him to the rendezvous point with the supply wagon and send him on his way. Roberta would know where to leave him so that Apache scouts could find him. She could return to the fort, resume her life, and pray that Morrison's suspicions would fade without proof. But even as she thought it, she knew it was impossible. Taza was the son of someone important. She had gathered that much from their halting conversations. If she simply abandoned him at a mission ruin with no explanation, his people might think she had harmed him, or that the soldiers had released him as part of some trap. The Apache had been betrayed too many times by white promises to trust such a convenient appearance. If she wanted to ensure his safe return, if she wanted to prevent her act of mercy from triggering a revenge raid that would kill innocents, she would have to take him herself. She would have to ride into Apache territory and face whatever judgment awaited her there. "Yes," she said finally. "I come with you. I take you to your father." Taza studied her face for a long moment, then nodded solemnly, as if they had just sealed a pact. In a way they had. Louisa was committing herself to a course of action that would almost certainly end her employment at the fort, might very well end her life, but felt like the only honorable path forward. She had saved this child, and now she would see that salvation through to its conclusion. She spent the rest of that day and night preparing with meticulous care. She packed her medical bag with supplies she might need, filled her canteen and 2 spare water bottles, and gathered what food she could without raising suspicion. She wrote a brief letter to Captain Edwards, apologizing for her sudden departure and requesting that he forward her final wages to an address in Philadelphia. She left the letter sealed on her small desk where it would be found after she was gone. She couldn't tell him the truth, but she could at least leave things in order. She also went through her medical texts and personal journals, setting aside the ones that contained observations and sketches that might be useful to future doctors working on the frontier. These she wrapped carefully and addressed to the Army Medical Department in Washington. Her groundbreaking work on treating scorpion envenomation, detailed notes on desert plants with medicinal properties, and case studies of treatments for common frontier ailments, all of it represented years of careful research. She couldn't let that knowledge die with her if things went badly. As the night deepened and the fort settled into the relative quiet of the late hours, Louisa helped Taza prepare for the journey. She had found clothing that would help him blend in during their escape, a 2 large shirt and pants that belonged to one of the younger soldiers, items she had been meaning to mend. Over these, she draped a serape that Maria had left in the laundry basket, a gesture Louisa now understood as deliberate provision. Taza looked strange in the white man's clothing, uncomfortable and out of place, but it would help them get past any casual observation. They left in the darkest hours before dawn, slipping out through the rear entrance of her quarters while the sentries were focused on the perimeter walls. Louisa had studied the guard rotations for months, noting the brief gaps when attention was elsewhere, and she used that knowledge now with her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give them away. They moved like shadows across the open ground behind the hospital, using the cover of buildings and wagons until they reached the livestock corral. The horses stirred restlessly as they approached, but Louisa had brought sugar lumps stolen from the officers' mess, and she used these to calm the animals while she selected 2 sturdy mounts. She saddled them with practiced efficiency, her hands working by feel in the darkness, every sound seeming impossibly loud. Taza watched silently, his small frame tense with readiness to run or fight. He had retrieved his knife and wore it openly now, no longer trying to hide what he was. They led the horses on foot toward the main gate, staying in the shadows, hearts in their throats. The supply wagon was already being loaded near the gate, Roberto and another worker moving crates under the supervision of a bored corporal who was more interested in his coffee than his duties. This was the most dangerous moment. They had to reach the wagon without being directly seen, had to somehow communicate with Roberto, had to trust that Maria's cousin would honor his debt. Louisa made a soft clicking sound, a signal Maria had told her to use. Roberto's head came up, his eyes finding them in the shadows. He said something to his fellow worker, who laughed and walked away to fetch more supplies. In that brief moment of privacy, Roberto gestured sharply toward the back of the wagon, where canvas covered the loaded cargo. Louisa understood. They had perhaps 30 seconds. She lifted Taza onto her horse, then mounted behind him, keeping him steady as they moved quickly to the wagon. Roberto had pulled back a section of canvas, revealing a space between crates that was just large enough. Louisa dismounted, lifted Taza down, and helped him crawl into the hiding space. Then she handed him the horse's reins through a gap in the canvas. "Stay quiet," she whispered urgently. "Don't move until we're far from the fort." She started to climb in after him, but Roberto grabbed her arm. "No, señorita," he hissed in Spanish. "You must ride as my assistant." "A woman hiding in the wagon. This will cause suspicion if they search. But a woman helping with the supply run. This they will believe. You have done this work before, yes?" Louisa nodded, understanding the wisdom of his words, even as her instincts screamed to stay with Taza. Roberto was right. She needed to be visible, to have a plausible reason for leaving the fort. She had occasionally helped with supply runs to the civilian settlements, her medical expertise useful for the sick or injured they might encounter. It was thin cover, but it was better than nothing. She tied the horses to the back of the wagon, where they would follow along, then climbed onto the driver's bench beside Roberto, just as the other worker returned with more crates. The corporal barely glanced at them as Roberto called out that they were ready to depart. The gate creaked open, and the wagon rolled forward into the pre-dawn darkness. Louisa didn't allow herself to look back, didn't let her body language betray the terror and exhilaration coursing through her veins. She had just deserted her post, stolen army horses, and was now smuggling an Apache child out of a military fort. If they were caught, the best she could hope for was a firing squad. The old mission ruins appeared as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Roberto pulled the wagon to a stop, ostensibly to rest the mules, and Louisa climbed down with shaking legs. She moved to the back of the wagon and pulled aside the canvas. Taza emerged, blinking in the growing light, his small face serious. This was where their paths should diverge, where she should send him on with instructions to find his people while she returned to face whatever consequences awaited at the fort. But even as she thought it, she saw the problem. The mission ruins were still too close to areas frequented by army patrols. If Taza was spotted alone, he would be captured or killed before he could reach safety. And she had made him a promise. She had told him she would take him to his father, and the weight of that oath pressed down on her with the inevitability of fate. "How far to your people?" she asked him, mixing English and Apache. Taza pointed toward a distinctive mesa formation visible in the distance, then held up fingers. 2 days' walk, maybe less on horseback. 2 days deeper into territory where the army rarely ventured, where every rock could hide a warrior, where her white skin would mark her as an enemy deserving of death. Roberto watched this exchange with worried eyes. "Señorita, you cannot go there," he said quietly in Spanish. "The Apache will kill you, even if the boy speaks for you. There are warriors who have lost too much to the white soldiers. They will not listen. They will only see another invader." Louisa looked at Taza, at this child who had trusted her when trust should have been impossible, who had learned to say, "You, good person," in a language that represented everything his people were fighting against. She thought about the oath she had taken to do no harm, to heal rather than hurt. Sometimes healing required more than medicine. Sometimes it required seeing a thing through to its completion, regardless of the cost. "I have to try," she said simply. Roberto shook his head, but didn't argue further. He provided them with additional water and food, supplies he would have to explain the loss of later, and watched with the expression of a man witnessing a suicide as Louisa and Taza mounted the horses and turned toward the distant mesa. The last thing Louisa heard as they rode away was Roberto's voice, calling after her in Spanish. "Vaya con Dios, doctora. May God protect the foolish and the brave." The landscape transformed as they traveled, the relatively flat approaches near the fort giving way to increasingly rugged terrain of arroyos, canyons and rock formations that seemed to shift and change in the harsh sunlight. Taza led the way with growing confidence, his posture straightening, his movements more assured as they moved deeper into country he knew. Louisa followed, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every possible ambush point. They rode in silence for the most part, conserving their energy and avoiding unnecessary noise that might draw attention. But as the sun reached its zenith and they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Taza spoke. His English had improved dramatically over their days together, and now he used it to tell her things he hadn't been able to express before. "My father is Goshevan," he said, the name carrying weight and pride. "He is war chief, very strong. Many warriors follow him." He paused, searching for words. "White soldiers kill my uncle, my cousins, 2 seasons ago. My father, he is very angry at white people. He says they take everything, give nothing." Louisa felt ice forming in her stomach. She had suspected Taza's father was someone important, but a war chief, one with personal grievances against white settlers and soldiers, that changed everything. She was riding into the camp of a man who had every reason to hate her, whose family had been murdered by people who looked like her, spoke like her. "Why you tell me this?" she asked quietly. Taza met her eyes, his young face ancient with the weight of his people's suffering. "So you know. So you understand. My father, he might kill you, even if I say you saved me. The pain, it is too big. It makes him not see good things, only bad things." He paused. "But I will try. I will tell him you are different, that you have kind heart." They continued riding, and Louisa used the time to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She reviewed everything she knew about Apache culture from her conversations with friendly scouts and from Taza himself. She knew that hospitality was sacred, that guests under protection could not be harmed without violating deep codes of honor. She knew that Apache society valued courage and directness, that any show of weakness or deception would be met with contempt. She would have to face Goshevan without flinching, would have to present herself as someone worthy of respect, even if she was ultimately judged worthy of death. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they entered a narrow canyon with walls that rose like cathedral spires on either side. Taza's body language changed, becoming alert but no longer fearful. "Close now," he said. "My people here." Louisa saw nothing but rock and shadow, no signs of habitation or life, but she trusted Taza's knowledge. They were being watched, she was certain of it, eyes tracking their progress from hidden vantage points. A figure materialized from behind a boulder so suddenly that Louisa's horse shied, nearly unseating her. A warrior, tall and lean, his face painted with ochre and white, a rifle held ready in his hands. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice sharp with challenge. Taza responded in the same language, his voice clear and strong, gesturing to Louisa and then to himself. The warrior's expression shifted from hostility to shock, his eyes widening as he truly looked at the boy for the first time. More warriors appeared, emerging from concealment like wolves materializing from mist. They surrounded Louisa and Taza, their weapons trained on her, their faces showing mixtures of confusion, anger, and disbelief. One of them, older than the rest, with scars crisscrossing his bare chest, stepped forward and spoke directly to Louisa in broken English. "You are white woman. You bring Chief's son. Why? This is trap?" His hand was on his knife, his body coiled to strike. Louisa forced herself to remain calm, to keep her hands visible and away from any weapons. "No trap," she said clearly. "I found him dying, scorpion sting. I healed him. Now I bring him home to his father." The scarred warrior translated this for the others, and a heated discussion broke out in Apache. Louisa caught Taza's name several times, and words that might have meant medicine or healing, but the overall tone was suspicious, aggressive. Finally, the scarred warrior turned back to her. "You will come with us. Chief will decide if you speak truth, or if you die for bringing child into white man's fort. If you try to run, we kill you fast. If you try to fight, we kill you slow. You understand?" Louisa nodded, her mouth dry. "I understand." They took her horse's reins, and the warriors formed an escort around them, half watching the back trail for pursuit, half watching Louisa, as if she might transform into a threat at any moment. They moved deeper into the canyon, until it opened into a hidden valley, where dozens of wickiups, the traditional Apache dwellings, were scattered among cottonwood trees near a spring. Women and children emerged from the shelters, their faces registering shock at the sight of their war chief's son returning alive, and greater shock at the white woman who had brought him. Taza slid from his horse and was immediately surrounded by people speaking rapidly, touching him as if to confirm he was real. An older woman, her face lined with grief that was now transforming into joy, pulled him into a fierce embrace, and Louisa realized this must be his mother. Through the crowd, a man approached. Louisa knew him instantly by the way the others parted to let him pass, by the authority evident in every line of his body. Goshevin was not the tallest man present, but he dominated the space around him with the force of his presence. His face was hard angles and sharp planes, his eyes black and penetrating, his long hair streaked with grey. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and at his belt hung weapons that had clearly seen extensive use. He looked at his son, at the boy he had believed lost or dead, and something flickered across his face too quickly to identify. Then his gaze shifted to Louisa, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force. This was a man who had killed, who had led raids, who had watched his family die at the hands of people like her. This was a man who had every reason to gut her where she stood and leave her body for the scavengers. Taza stepped forward and began to speak in Apache, his voice strong and clear despite his obvious exhaustion. He gestured to his hand, to Louisa, told what must have been the story of his rescue. Goshevin listened without interruption, his face carved from stone, impossible to read. When Taza finished, silence fell over the assembled group. The war chief took a step toward Louisa, and every warrior tensed, ready to act on his command. Goshevin spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. The scarred warrior translated, his tone neutral but his eyes showing surprise at whatever had been said. "The chief says you saved his son's life when you could have left him to die. You brought him home when you could have given him to the soldiers. This is a debt that cannot be easily repaid." The warrior paused, listening as Goshevin continued. He asks, "What do you want as payment for this service?" Louisa's mind raced. This was a test, she was certain of it. Ask for too much and she would appear greedy, grasping. Ask for too little, and she would insult the gravity of the debt. She thought about everything she had given up, her position at the fort, her safety, possibly her life, and she realized that none of it had been done in expectation of reward. She had saved Taza because it was right, because her oath as a healer demanded it, because she had looked at a dying child and seen a life worth saving, regardless of politics or race. "I want nothing," she said clearly. "Your son was dying. I am a healer. I did what any healer would do. There is no debt." She saw surprise ripple through the watching Apache, saw Goshevin's eyes narrow. The scarred warrior didn't translate immediately, instead speaking rapidly to the chief in Apache, as if questioning whether he had heard correctly. Goshevin responded, his voice sharp, and the warrior turned back to Louisa. "The chief says you are either very wise or very foolish. A life debt among the Apache is sacred. It binds families together. It creates obligations that last generations. By refusing payment, you place the chief in a difficult position. He cannot let such a debt go unanswered." The warrior paused. He asks again, "What do you want?" Louisa understood then that this wasn't about greed or reward. This was about honor, about balance in a world that had been thrown catastrophically out of balance by war and betrayal. Goshevin needed to discharge this obligation, not for her sake, but for his own, to maintain the codes that governed his people's society. She thought carefully about what she could ask for that would honor the debt without demanding something impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. "Safe passage," she said finally. "Let me leave here alive and unmolested. Let me return to my people. That is all I ask." It was a simple request, survival instead of death, but she saw immediately that it was the right answer. Goshevin nodded slowly, and for the first time, something that might have been respect showed in his eyes. He spoke again, and this time the scarred warrior's translation carried a different tone entirely. "The chief says, you will have safe passage. But more than this, you will have the protection of his name. Any Apache who meets you will know that you are friend to Goshevin, that you saved his son, that to harm you is to harm him." The warrior smiled slightly, the first hint of warmth Louisa had seen from any of them. "This is a great gift, white woman. You will be able to travel in places where others of your kind would die. You will be welcomed in Apache camps. You have earned something very rare." But Goshevin wasn't finished. He spoke at length, his voice taking on a formal quality, and Louisa saw shock and excitement ripple through the assembled people. The scarred warrior's face went carefully blank as he translated. "The chief says one more thing. Among his people, such a debt, the saving of a chief's son. This debt is traditionally paid with family bonds. You have saved his child. This makes you valuable beyond gold or horses. He offers you the greatest honor he can bestow." The warrior paused, seeming reluctant to continue. "He asks if you will become his wife." The words hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot, impossible to call back, transforming everything in an instant. Louisa stared at Goshevin, searching his face for any sign that this was a cruel joke or a test she was meant to fail, but his expression remained grave and sincere. Around them, the assembled Apache watched with a mixture of curiosity and approval, as if the war chief had just proposed something perfectly reasonable rather than utterly insane. Marry him. Become the wife of an Apache war chief. Bind herself permanently to a people who were at war with everything she had known. Her first instinct was to refuse, to laugh at the absurdity of it, but she caught herself. This wasn't about romance or desire. This was about honor and obligation, about the complex web of reciprocity that governed Apache society. Goshevin wasn't proposing because he loved her or even knew her. He was offering the only form of payment his culture recognized as equivalent to the debt he owed. By saving Taza, she had created a bond that could only be answered by bringing her into the family permanently. "I don't understand," Louisa said carefully, buying time to think. Among my people, marriage is about love, about choosing a partner for life. This is different, the scarred warrior translated, and Goshevan responded, his voice patient but firm. The chief says among his people, marriage is about many things. Love, yes, but also alliance, protection, obligation. He has 2 other wives who manage his household and care for his children. You would not be expected to share his dwelling or his bed unless you wished it. You would be part of his family, under his protection, with all the rights and status that brings. You would be Apache. Louisa's mind raced through the implications. If she accepted, she would be severing herself completely from white society. She would never be able to return to Philadelphia, never practice medicine in any army fort or civilian hospital. She would be branded a traitor, a squaw, subjected to the particular contempt reserved for white women who crossed racial lines. But if she refused, she would insult Goshevan in front of his entire band, would throw his generous offer back in his face. The safe passage he had promised might evaporate, replaced by anger at the rejection of such an honor. Yet there was another consideration, one that cut deeper than personal safety or social status. She looked around at the Apache camp, at the women and children who watched from the wickiups, at the warriors whose faces showed the accumulated scars of endless conflict. These people were fighting a losing war against an enemy with superior numbers and resources. They were being pushed from their ancestral lands, hunted like animals, their way of life systematically destroyed. And they were dying from more than bullets. She had seen the reports at Fort Bayard, had heard Captain Edwards speak of measles and cholera tearing through Apache camps, of children dying from diseases they had no immunity against. If she became Apache, if she accepted this impossible offer, she could help. She could bring medical knowledge to people who desperately needed it. She could teach them about sanitation and disease prevention, could treat injuries and illnesses that would otherwise be fatal. She would be one person against an ocean of suffering, but one person could still matter. One person could still save lives. If I agree, Louisa said slowly, I would want to continue my work as a healer. I would want to help your people, teach them what I know about medicine. I would not simply be a wife in name only. I would be useful. Goshevan listened to the translation, and for the first time, something like approval showed in his dark eyes. He spoke briefly, and the scarred warrior smiled as he translated. The chief says a wife who brings skills and knowledge is worth more than 10 wives who bring only beauty. He accepts your condition. You will be healer to the band, teacher of medicine ways. This is a good arrangement. Louisa took a deep breath, standing on the edge of a decision that would reshape her entire existence. She thought of her father in Philadelphia, of the society she had fled, of the small, safe life she could have had if she had been willing to conform. Then she thought of Taza's fevered body in the desert, of the choice she had made to save him, despite every rational reason not to. That choice had led her here to this moment, and there was a strange inevitability to it, as if every decision she had made since leaving Philadelphia had been pointing toward this precipice. I accept, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I will marry Goshevan. I will become Apache. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The women broke into ululating cries of celebration, a sound that sent shivers down Louisa's spine. Warriors began to chant, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to make the earth itself vibrate. Taza pushed through the crowd and grabbed her hand, his young face split by a grin. Now you are family, he said in English. Now you are my mother. The words struck her like a physical blow. Mother. She hadn't thought about that aspect, hadn't considered that accepting Goshevan's proposal meant becoming a parent to his children, including the boy she had saved. But as she looked down at Taza's eager face, she realized it felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She had already risked everything for him. Why not go further? The marriage ceremony happened 3 days later, time Louisa spent in a whirlwind of preparation and cultural immersion that left her head spinning. Goshevan's 2 existing wives, Desba and Nalin, took charge of her transformation with an efficiency that suggested they had done this before, though they made it clear through gestures and the few English words they knew that a white wife was unprecedented. Desba, the elder wife, was a woman in her 40s, with grey threading through her black hair and eyes that held both wisdom and deep sorrow. Nalin was younger, perhaps 30, with a quick smile and hands that never seemed to stop moving, always working on some task. They burned Louisa's travelling clothes in a ceremonial fire, the smoke carrying away her old identity. They dressed her in a doe-skin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, a garment that had belonged to Goshevin's mother and was considered sacred. They wove her hair in the Apache style, parting it down the middle and wrapping sections with leather cords strung with turquoise and shell beads. They painted her face with ochre and white clay, in patterns that had meaning she didn't fully understand, but that marked her as bride and healer. Through it all, they spoke to her in a mixture of Apache and broken English, teaching her the words for family members, for daily objects, for the things a wife should know. They showed her how to prepare food the Apache way, how to tan hides, how to identify edible plants in the desert. But they also asked her questions about medicine, about the white man's healing techniques, testing her knowledge with the seriousness of scholars evaluating a colleague. On the night before the wedding, Desba sat with Louisa outside her wickiup, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Through a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple words, she told Louisa about her own marriage to Goshevin, how she had been wife for 20 years, how she had borne him 4 children, though only Taza and a daughter had survived past infancy. She spoke of the grief that lived in Goshevin's heart, the rage at watching his people die, the impossible burden of leading warriors who knew they were fighting a war they could not win. "He is good man," Desba said carefully in English, "but he carry much pain. You bring him back his son. This is miracle to him. You give him hope he thought was dead." She paused, searching for words. "He will not love you like first wife, like Nalin, but he will honor you. He will protect you. And maybe you help heal his spirit like you heal his son's body." The wedding itself was unlike anything Louisa had experienced or imagined. There was no church, no minister, no formal vows in the Christian sense. Instead, the entire band gathered around a large fire as the sun set, painting the sky in violent shades of red and orange. A medicine man, ancient and weathered like a piece of driftwood, chanted prayers in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. Goshevin stood in his finest ceremonial dress, weapons at his side, his face painted for war and marriage in equal measure. Louisa was led forward by Desba and Nalin, each holding one of her arms, presenting her to their husband as a gift and a responsibility. The medicine man tied their hands together with a braided cord made from horsehair and sinew, binding them physically as they were being bound spiritually. He spoke words in Apache that rolled and twisted like running water, words about obligation and honor, about the joining of souls and the strengthening of the band. Then Goshevin spoke, his voice carrying across the assembled people, and though Louisa couldn't understand all the words, she caught her name, caught Taza's name, caught the word for healing repeated several times. He was telling their story, she realized, explaining to his people how this impossible union had come to be. When he finished, he looked directly at her, and in his eyes she saw not love, but something perhaps more valuable, respect and gratitude, and a fierce determination to honor the debt he owed. The scarred warrior, whose name she had learned was Nychez, stepped forward to translate the final part. "Goshevin says you are now his wife, part of his family, blood of his blood. He says you are now Apache, and any who harm you must answer to him. He says you bring medicine and wisdom to the people, and this is a blessing in dark times." Nychez paused, then added his own words. "He also says, if you ever wish to leave, to return to your people, you may do so with his blessing. This is unusual. Normally, wives are bound forever, but you came freely, saved his son freely, and he will not cage a bird that chose to land on his hand." The celebration that followed was both joyous and bittersweet. Food was shared, venison and rabbit and corn prepared in ways that were foreign to Louisa's palate, but delicious nonetheless. There was dancing, warriors moving in complex patterns around the fire, while women sang songs that spoke of ancient victories and sorrows. Liquor appeared from somewhere, traded or stolen from white settlements, and toasts were made in a mixture of Apache and English and Spanish, 3 languages mingling like the people themselves. Children ran between the wiki-ups in the firelight, their laughter a counterpoint to the weight of adult concerns. Louisa watched them and thought about the future, about the children who would be born into this dying world, about whether her medical knowledge could help them survive the diseases and violence that surrounded them. Rosa sat beside her for much of the evening, translating when he could, explaining customs and introducing her to various members of the band. He seemed to take his role as her son seriously, protective and proud in equal measure. As the night deepened and people began to drift away to their wiki-ups, Goshevin approached Louisa. He gestured for her to follow him, and she did, her heart suddenly pounding. He led her not to his own dwelling, but to a smaller wiki-up that had been prepared specifically for her, a space of her own within the family compound. Inside, someone had laid out sleeping furs and placed her medical bag carefully in the corner. Along with the few possessions she had brought from the fort, Goshevin stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying firelight outside. He spoke in Apache, slowly so she might understand some of it, and Nychez, who had followed at a discreet distance, translated from outside. "The chief says this is your place. You are not required to share his dwelling. When he needs to speak with you about band matters or healing, he will come here or send for you. Otherwise, you are free to do as you wish, to practice your medicine, to teach, to learn our ways." Nychez paused. "He says he knows this is not the marriage you would have chosen in your old life, but he hopes you will find purpose and perhaps even happiness in your new one." Before Louisa could respond, Goshevin did something unexpected. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small object, pressing it into her hand. It was a stone, smooth and dark, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. "His mother's," Nychez translated. "A healing stone, blessed by the medicine men of his grandfather's time. He wants you to have it, to use it in your work. It is a great honor." Louisa closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its weight, its warmth, from being carried close to Goshevin's body. "Thank you," she said in Apache, one of the phrases she had learned. "I will honor this gift." Goshevin nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone in her new home. The next morning, Louisa woke to a reality that was almost impossible to comprehend. She was married to an Apache war chief. She lived in a wiki-up in the middle of hostile territory. She was now, by any definition that mattered, Apache herself. The enormity of what she had done should have terrified her. But instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if she had finally found the place she was meant to be. Desba appeared at her dwelling with the sun, carrying a bowl of corn mush and dried berries. She ate with Louisa, teaching her the proper way to prepare the morning meal, the rituals and customs that governed daily life. Then she took Louisa on a tour of the camp, introducing her to the other women, showing her where water was collected, where food was stored, how the wiki-ups were arranged in family groups with specific meanings and hierarchies. But what struck Louisa most was the medical need that was immediately apparent. She saw children with persistent coughs, warriors with poorly healed wounds, women suffering from infections that could be easily treated with proper care. She saw malnutrition, saw the signs of vitamin deficiencies, saw dental problems that could lead to sepsis and death. This band was surviving but barely, and without intervention. Many of them would not survive another hard winter. She set up what amounted to a field hospital in her wiki-up, organizing her medical supplies and creating a space where she could see patients. Desba and Nalin helped spread the word, and soon there was a line of people waiting to see the white medicine woman who had saved the chief's son. Some came with skepticism, testing her, but Louisa's skill was undeniable. She treated a young warrior's infected knife wound, cleaning it properly and applying carbolic acid that burned but prevented the gangrene that would have cost him his arm. She showed a mother how to make a steam tent for her child's persistent cough, using heated stones and water to create moist air that loosened the congestion. She set a broken finger that had healed crooked, re-breaking it under controlled circumstances and splinting it properly. She treated burns, cuts, fevers, infections, all while teaching anyone who would listen about the principles behind the treatments. Cleanliness was her constant refrain, the importance of washing wounds, of boiling water, of keeping living spaces free from waste. Many of the women already knew these things instinctively, but Louisa gave them the why behind the what, explaining about invisible organisms that cause disease, about how infections spread. Taza became her assistant, translating medical terms, helping her understand when patients were too shy or proud to fully explain their symptoms. His hand had healed completely, leaving only a small scar, and he took pride in telling everyone how the white medicine woman had saved him from certain death. His testimony carried weight, and gradually the skepticism faded, replaced by a cautious acceptance. Word of her work spread to other bands. Apache from neighboring groups began to appear, seeking treatment for ailments they had suffered with for years. Louisa treated them all, making no distinction between Gosheven's people and others. This too earned her respect, the willingness to help anyone who needed it, regardless of political affiliation. But her acceptance within the band brought new dangers from outside. 3 weeks after the wedding, scouts brought news that sent a chill through the camp. The army had learned of her marriage to Gosheven, had branded her a traitor and a deserter. There was a reward being offered for her capture, dead or alive. Lieutenant Morrison had sworn he would personally bring her back to face military justice, had been given permission to lead patrols, specifically to search for her. More troubling still, a rival Apache band, led by a war chief named Victorio, had begun raiding white settlements with increased ferocity. Victorio's warriors were angry young men who had lost everything to white expansion and wanted blood in return. They saw Gosheven's acceptance of a white wife as weakness, as proof that he had become soft. Tensions between the bands escalated. Threats were exchanged, and there was talk of challenge, of combat to determine who had the right to speak for the Apache people. Louisa found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Her presence had become political, a symbol being interpreted in contradictory ways. To some, she represented hope, the possibility of learning white medicine while maintaining Apache identity. To others, she was contamination, proof that Gosheven was compromised and unfit to lead. The pressure built like thunderclouds gathering over the desert. It was Nychez who brought her the news that changed everything. He found her outside her wickiup, grinding herbs for a poultice, and his face was grave. Victorio has issued formal challenge to Gosheven. They will meet in 3 days at the sacred grounds. Combat will decide who leads, whose vision for the people will prevail. He paused. Victorio has said that if he wins, you will be killed as example, as proof that Apache and white cannot mix. If Gosheven wins, Victorio's band must accept his authority, including his marriage to you. Louisa felt her blood turn to ice. Gosheven would be fighting not just for leadership, but for her life. If he lost, she would die, and any hope of peace between the bands would die with her. If he won, the divisions might deepen, creating rifts that could destroy the Apache from within, even as white soldiers destroyed them from without. She found Gosheven in his wickiup, sharpening his weapons with methodical precision. He looked up as she entered, unsurprised by her intrusion. "You have heard," he said in his careful English, words he had been practicing. "Yes," Louisa said. "You're going to fight because of me. This is my fault." Gosheven set down his knife and stood, his presence filling the small space. "No, I fight because Victorio challenges my authority, questions my decisions. This was coming with or without you. Your presence only provides excuse." He paused. "But I will not lie. If I lose, you die. This troubles me. You have brought much good to my people. It would be waste. Then don't lose, Louisa said, trying to inject confidence she didn't feel into her voice. Goshevin smiled grimly. Victorio is younger, faster. He has rage that makes him dangerous. I have experience and wisdom, but these do not always win battles. He reached out and touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance. If I fall, you must run. Nechez will help you reach white settlements. Do not try to stay, to plead for mercy. Victorio will show none. The 3 days before the challenge passed in a haze of preparation and dread. Louisa continued her medical work, treating patients and teaching, trying to maintain normalcy even as everyone in the camp knew what was coming. Desba and Nalin prepared Goshevin's weapons and ceremonial dress, their faces stoic but their eyes betraying their fear. Taza stayed close to Louisa, his usual cheerfulness subdued, and she realized he was afraid of losing his father or his new mother. 2 pillars of his world suddenly made fragile. When the day arrived, the entire band traveled to the sacred grounds, a flat expanse of rock surrounded by ancient petroglyphs carved by ancestors long dead. Victorio's band was already there, their warriors painted for war, their faces hard with anticipation. Victorio himself was everything Goshevin had described, young and lean and burning with fury that radiated off him like heat from stone. The combat would be traditional, hand-to-hand with knives, fought until one man yielded or died. There would be no interference, no mercy, only the brutal mathematics of survival. Goshevin stripped to his breechcloth, his body showing the accumulated scars of a lifetime of warfare, and stepped into the circle. Victorio did the same, his younger body unmarked by comparison, testament to his speed and skill at avoiding injury. As the medicine man began the ritual chants that would open the combat, Louisa stood with Desba and Nalin, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. She had saved Taza's life in the desert, had crossed into Apache territory, had married a war chief to honor a debt. But now all of that hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of a fight she could not influence, could only witness. She had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of forces beyond her control. The medicine man's final cry echoed off the rocks, and the 2 warriors began to circle each other. Knives gleaming in the harsh desert sun, the combat was brutal poetry. 2 men moving in patterns older than memory, each step a calculation between aggression and caution. Victorio struck first, his blade flashing in a low arc meant to gut his opponent, but Goshevin twisted away with surprising grace for a man his age. The older warrior's counterstrike came instantly, a slash aimed at Victorio's throat that missed by inches as the younger man jerked backward. Blood first. That was the rule in these challenges. The first man to draw blood claimed momentum, claimed the psychological advantage that could tip the balance. They circled each other like wolves, feet stirring dust that hung in the still air. The watching warriors from both bands had gone silent. The only sounds, the scuff of feet on rock and the harsh breathing of the combatants. Louisa watched with her heart in her throat, every muscle in her body tensed, as if she could somehow will strength into Goshevin's limbs. Beside her, Taza gripped her hand so tightly her fingers went numb. But she didn't pull away. The boy was watching his father fight for his life, for their family, for everything. Victorio feinted left, then came in fast from the right, his knife seeking the soft flesh beneath Goshevin's ribs. The older warrior caught his wrist, twisted, and for a moment they were locked together, straining muscle against muscle. Goshevin was heavier, more grounded, but Victorio's youth gave him explosive power. He broke free with a violent wrench and spun away, his blade leaving a thin red line across Goshevin's shoulder. First blood. The younger warriors of Victorio's band erupted in shouts of approval, but Goshevin's face showed no pain, no acknowledgement of the wound. He had been cut 1,000 times in his life, and this was nothing, a scratch that barely warranted attention. He adjusted his stance slightly, favoring his left side now, drawing Victorio in. The younger warrior took the bait, pressing his advantage, coming in high with an overhand strike meant to drive down through Goshevin's collarbone. It was a killing blow if it landed, and for a heartbeat Louisa thought it would connect. Then Goshevin moved with a speed that defied his years, slipping inside Victorio's guard and driving his knife up in a short, vicious arc. The blade opened a deep gash along Victorio's ribs, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to hurt, deep enough to slow him. The younger warrior stumbled back, his free hand going to his side, where blood was already flowing freely. The tide had shifted. What followed was a masterclass in experienced warfare against youthful aggression. Victorio fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was losing, throwing everything into wild attacks that grew increasingly reckless. Goshevin absorbed the assault, deflecting and dodging, taking minor cuts but never yielding ground. He was waiting for the moment when rage and pain would make Victorio careless, when youth's impatience would create an opening. It came when Victorio lunged forward in a straight thrust meant to end things quickly. Goshevin sidestepped, caught the younger man's extended arm, and using Victorio's own momentum, threw him to the ground. Before Victorio could recover, Goshevin's knee was on his chest, knife at his throat, the fight effectively over. The older warrior's voice carried clearly across the sacred grounds. "Yield, Victorio. You have fought with honor. There is no shame in yielding to experience." For a long, terrible moment, Louisa thought Victorio would refuse, would choose death over submission. His eyes burned with fury and humiliation, his body trembling with the effort to continue fighting. But finally, with visible reluctance, he spoke the word that ended the challenge. "I yield." Goshevin stood immediately, offering his hand to help the younger warrior to his feet. Victorio stared at the offered hand, then at Goshevin's face, and something passed between them, some unspoken communication. Finally, he grasped Goshevin's forearm, allowing himself to be pulled upright. The medicine man stepped forward, raising his staff. His ancient voice proclaimed Goshevin the victor, his authority confirmed, his decisions validated by combat as the old ways demanded. Victorio's warriors, bound by honor to accept the outcome, lowered their weapons. But Goshevin wasn't finished. He turned to face both assembled bands, his voice strong despite his exhaustion and wounds. Natchez translated quietly for Louisa, standing just behind her. "Goshevin says the challenge is done, but the question behind it remains. Can Apache and White coexist? Can we learn from our enemies without becoming them? He says his white wife has brought healing to his people, has taught them medicine that saves lives. He says she asks nothing in return, takes no payment for her work. He says this is the action of a good person, not an enemy." Natchez paused, listening as Goshevin continued. "He says Victorio's rage is justified. We have all lost too much to the white soldiers, to the settlers who take our land. But rage alone will not save us. We must be clever as well as strong, must learn what we can while remaining Apache in our hearts." Victorio listened, his hand pressed against his bleeding ribs, his face unreadable. When Goshevin finished, the younger warrior spoke, his voice bitter but no longer actively hostile. "I accept your authority, Goshevin. I accept that the white woman may stay, but I will not pretend to like it, and I will not trust her. If she brings harm to our people, through treachery or simply by drawing white soldiers to us, I will hold you responsible." It wasn't friendship, wasn't even true acceptance, but it was a grudging acknowledgement that Goshevin's decision would stand. Louisa waited until the formal gathering had dispersed before approaching Goshevin. The other warriors had carried him to his wickiup, where Desba and Nalin were already preparing to tend his wounds. Louisa entered with her medical bag, her professional instincts overriding any awkwardness about treating her husband. Goshevin looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "You wish to practice your medicine on me, wife?" he asked in English. "You're bleeding and probably have cracked ribs," Louisa said firmly, falling back into the authoritative tone she used with stubborn patience. "Sit down and let me examine you before infection sets in." To her surprise, Goshevin complied, allowing her to clean and dress his various cuts, to probe his ribs gently to assess the damage. Two were definitely cracked, not broken, which meant painful breathing, but no danger of punctured lungs. She bound his torso tightly to support the injured ribs, mixing a pain-relieving tea from willow bark and other herbs. As she worked, Desba and Nalin watched with interest, occasionally asking questions about her techniques, about the reasons behind certain treatments. This became a teaching moment, Louisa explaining about wound care and bone healing while demonstrating her methods. Even Naiches, who had followed to ensure Goshevan was properly cared for, leaned in to listen, his scarred face intent. "You fought well," Louisa said quietly to Goshevan as she finished bandaging. "Thank you for not dying." Goshevan's harsh face softened slightly. "I'm too stubborn to die, and I had good reason to win. My son needs his father. My people need their chief. And you, I think, need more time to finish your work here." He paused. "You are a good healer, Louisa. You belong here, whether Victorio believes it or not." The weeks following the challenge brought a subtle shift in the camp's dynamics. Victorio's band, while not fully integrated, began to camp closer to Goshevan's people, drawn by the security of numbers and the grudging acknowledgement that Goshevan's leadership had been legitimately confirmed. Some of Victorio's warriors even began to visit Louisa's wickiup for medical treatment, though they came reluctantly and often tested her with their hostility. One such warrior was a young man named Cochise, nephew to Victorio, who arrived with a badly infected arrow wound in his thigh that he had been hiding for days out of pride. By the time he finally sought help, red streaks were climbing up his leg toward his groin, a clear sign that sepsis was setting in. Without treatment, he would be dead within a day or two. Louisa worked on him for hours, cleaning the wound thoroughly, removing dead tissue, applying hot compresses to draw out the infection. She administered a strong tea of echinacea and golden seal to boost his immune system, kept him hydrated with water mixed with a touch of salt and honey. Gokis endured the treatment with stoic silence, but his eyes followed her every movement, watching for any sign of treachery or incompetence. For 3 days, his life hung in the balance while fever ravaged his body. Louisa stayed with him during the worst of it, monitoring his condition, changing dressings, forcing fluids between his cracked lips. Taza helped, bringing fresh water and clean cloths, translating when Cochise was lucid enough to speak. On the 4th day, the fever broke. The infection began to recede, the red streaks fading, color returning to Cochise's face. When he was well enough to stand, to return to his uncle's camp, Cochise stopped at the entrance to Louisa's wickiup. He spoke in Apache, his voice gruff, and Taza translated with barely suppressed excitement. "He says you saved his life when you could have let him die. He says he was wrong about you. He says any enemy of yours is his enemy. It was a warrior's oath of protection, given freely, and tears stung Louisa's eyes as she nodded acceptance. But even as she was winning hearts one patient at a time, the larger threat was closing in. Lieutenant Morrison had not forgotten his vendetta against the woman he considered a traitor and deserter. He had been systematically questioning settlers, tracking rumors, piecing together information about Apache movements. And he had finally gotten a lead, a Mexican trader who had seen a white woman living among the Apache, who could describe the location of their camps with enough accuracy to mount a raid. The first warning came from Apache scouts who had been watching the army's movements. A large patrol was heading into the territory, too many soldiers to be a simple reconnaissance. They were coming in force, and they were coming toward Goshevan's band. The camp erupted into controlled chaos as warriors prepared for battle. Women and children were sent to hiding places in the canyon systems. Supplies were cached in secret locations. Goshevan called a council of his senior warriors, and to Louisa's surprise, he insisted she attend. "You are reason they come," he said bluntly. "You should know what we face, what we plan." The council convened in the center of the camp, men sitting in a circle with weapons close at hand. Natchez reported what the scouts had learned. 50 soldiers, well armed, led by Morrison. They were 3 days away, moving slowly through difficult terrain. The debate that followed was intense. Some warriors wanted to attack immediately, to ambush the soldiers in the narrow canyons where superior numbers meant little. Others argued for retreat deeper into the mountains where the army couldn't follow easily. A few suggested surrendering Louisa, giving Morrison what he wanted in exchange for peace. It was this last suggestion that made Gosheven's face harden into stone. "The woman is my wife," he said, his voice cold as winter wind. "She is Apache. We do not surrender our own to appease our enemies. Any man who suggests this again will answer to me personally." The warrior who had made the suggestion lowered his eyes, properly chastised. Louisa listened to the debate with growing dread. Men were going to die because of her, both Apache and soldiers. Young men with families, with futures, would bleed into the desert sand because she had chosen to save a child's life and accepted the consequences. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. When the council broke up with plans for an ambush still being debated, Louisa approached Gosheven. They stood outside his wickiup under a sky so vast and star-filled it seemed to swallow all human concerns. "I should leave," she said quietly. "If I go to them, if I surrender to Morrison, this doesn't have to become a battle." Gosheven turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "You would do this? Give yourself to man who hates you, who will see you hanged or shot as deserter? You would sacrifice yourself for Apache, who 2 months ago were strangers to you?" Louisa met his gaze steadily. "I would sacrifice myself to prevent unnecessary death. Apache or white, they're still people. They still have families who love them. How many more have to die before this cycle ends?" For a long moment, Gosheven said nothing. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and cupped her face gently with one large, calloused hand. "You have healer's heart," he said softly. "You see all life as sacred, worth protecting. This is beautiful thing, but also dangerous thing in world like ours." He paused. "I will not let you sacrifice yourself. You are my wife. More than this, you have become valuable to my people. But I will think on what you say, about cycles of death, about whether there is another way." The next morning, Gosheven made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of preparing for ambush, instead of sending Louisa away or hiding deeper in the mountains, he announced that he would go to meet the soldiers under flag of truce. He would take Louisa with him, along with Nightshades and 3 other warriors. They would meet Morrison before he reached the camp, would attempt to talk before resorting to violence. Many of his warriors protested. Trusting white soldiers had never ended well for the Apache. Flags of truce had been violated. Peace talks had turned into massacres. Promises had been broken so many times that only a fool would believe in them anymore. But Gosheven was adamant. "If we ambush them, more soldiers will come, then more. The army is endless river. We are puddle that grows smaller each season. We must try different way, even if it fails." And so, 2 days later, Louisa found herself riding toward her past, toward the life she had abandoned, with her Apache husband and his warriors flanking her. They carried a white cloth tied to a pole, the universal signal of parley, though everyone knew it was only as good as the honor of the men they would meet. As they crested a ridge and saw the line of blue-uniformed soldiers marching through the valley below, Louisa's heart began to race. Lieutenant Morrison sat astride his horse at the head of the column, and even at this distance she could see the way his body went rigid when he spotted them. He raised his hand, halting the patrol, and after a brief consultation with his sergeants, he rode forward with 5 soldiers to meet them. The 2 groups stopped 20 yards apart, close enough to talk, far enough to react if violence erupted. Morrison's face was a mask of contempt as he looked at Louisa. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. "Or should I say Mrs. Gosheven? I've come a long way to find you. The army takes desertion seriously, especially when it involves stealing horses and harboring the enemy." His eyes flicked to Gosheven. "I'm authorized to take you back by any means necessary. Tell your savage husband that this doesn't concern him." Louisa felt Gosheven tense beside her, felt the warrior's hands moving toward weapons, and she knew they were seconds away from bloodshed. She spoke quickly, her voice carrying clearly across the gap between the two groups. "Lieutenant Morrison, I did not desert. I left to return a child to his family, a child I saved from death. I made a choice to stay because I can help these people, because they need medical care and I can provide it. I'm not a soldier. I never took an oath to the army. I'm a healer, and I go where I'm needed." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Pretty speech, but it doesn't change the facts. You stole government property and you're living among hostiles. That's treason." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me peacefully, or I'm going to take you by force. And if your Apache friends try to stop me, I have 50 soldiers who will turn this place into a graveyard." Goshevin spoke then, his English carefully pronounced, each word weighted with authority. "The woman is my wife. She saved my son's life. Among my people, this creates sacred bond. You cannot have her." Morrison's face reddened. "I don't give a damn about your savage customs. She's coming with me, and you're going to let her. Or a lot of people are going to die today." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, everyone waiting for someone to make the first move, to tip the situation into violence. Louisa looked at the soldiers, many of them young men she had treated for minor ailments at Fort Bayard, good men who didn't deserve to die in a fight over her fate. She looked at the Apache warriors, at Nichez's scarred face set in grim determination, at Goshevin's proud refusal to back down, and she made her choice. Louisa dismounted from her horse slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to prevent the trigger-happy soldiers from opening fire. She walked forward into the no-man's land between the two groups. Behind her she heard Goshevin call out in Apache, but she didn't stop. She positioned herself directly between Morrison and the Apache warriors, a human shield that would force both sides to reconsider violence. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said clearly, "you're right that I left Fort Bayard without permission. But I'm not a deserter because I was never enlisted. I was a civilian employee, nothing more." She paused. "You want to arrest me? Fine, I'll go with you peacefully. But first let me show you something." She gestured back toward where Taza had ridden up with a group of Apache women and children. Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm, but Louisa held up her hand. "Just look, Lieutenant. Look at what you're about to destroy." Taza came forward leading the group, warriors Louisa had treated, children whose fevers she had broken, women whose difficult births she had attended. One by one they showed their scars, their healed wounds, spoke through Nichez's translation about how the white medicine woman had saved them. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a woman who had betrayed her people. This was a healer who had transcended the boundaries of race and politics to simply save lives. Louisa saw something shift in Morrison's face. "You can arrest me, Lieutenant. You can drag me back in chains. But ask yourself what that accomplishes. These people will lose the only trained doctor they have access to. More will die from preventable causes. And for what? To satisfy your pride," one of Morrison's sergeants spoke up. "Lieutenant, the lady has a point. We all know she saved Private Henderson's life last year. She's done more good at that fort than half the commissioned officers." Other soldiers murmured agreement. Morrison's jaw worked. "What are you proposing?" Nadi asked finally. "I propose a treaty of sorts. Goshevin's people will not raid the settlements or attack army patrols. In exchange, the fort will provide medical supplies to me so I can continue my work here and will not pursue prosecution for my departure." Morrison stared at her. "You want the army to supply an Apache camp? That's insane." Goshevin spoke then, his voice carrying weight. "My warriors have not raided white settlements since my son returned. We have kept peace. Ask your scouts." Morrison glanced at one of his men, who nodded reluctantly. "It was true. If you arrest me," Louisa continued, "that peace ends. The raids will resume. More soldiers will die. More settlers will die. More Apache will die. Is that what you want your legacy to be, Lieutenant?" The silence stretched out. Finally, Morrison spoke. "I don't have authority to approve any formal treaty, but I can report back that your continued presence serves army interests." He paused. "Unofficially, of course. It wasn't the endorsement Louisa had hoped for, but it was enough. "I'll need medical supplies," she said. "I'll send a list through the Mexican traders in Silver City." Morrison nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do. But understand this, Miss Pemberton. If Goshevan's warriors break the peace, I will come back here with every soldier I can muster and burn this camp to the ground. You included." It was a threat and a promise. Louisa accepted it with a nod. The two groups separated, Morrison's patrol turning back toward Fort Bayard. As they rode to camp, Naiches moved his horse close to Louisa's. "You took great risk," he said quietly. "Morrison could have arrested you, could have ordered his men to fire. I gamble with my life every day I stay here." Louisa replied. At least this time, it was for something that might prevent more death. When they reached camp, the entire band was waiting. The relief was palpable. That evening, Goshevan came to Louisa's wickiup. He carried a bundle wrapped in soft leather. "This belonged to my mother," he said in careful English. "She was healer too. When she died, I kept her tools, thinking someday they would go to daughter." He paused. "But my daughter is not healer. You are. It should be yours." Louisa unwrapped the bundle with trembling hands. Inside were tools of incredible age, bone needles for suturing, stone blades, pouches of dried herbs. These were heirlooms, sacred objects. Tears blurred her vision. "I will honor these," she whispered. "I will use them to heal as your mother did." Goshevan nodded. Then he embraced her, a brief but genuine expression of affection and respect. "You are good wife," he said simply. "Not wife I expected, but wife I needed. You bring hope to people who had forgotten what hope feels like." He paused at the entrance. "Morrison will keep his word, I think. But there will be others who are not practical, who see only war. We must be ready." The months that followed proved Goshevan right. Medical supplies began to arrive through circuitous routes, packages left with trusted traders. Morrison was keeping his word, using his influence to funnel resources to the woman who had become an unofficial bridge between worlds. Louisa's medical practice expanded, her reputation spreading to other Apache groups, but not everyone accepted this new reality. There were army officers who saw Morrison's pragmatism as treason, settlers who viewed any accommodation with the Apache as weakness. The peace was fragile, maintained by constant vigilance and the undeniable results of Louisa's healing work. Giza grew from boy to young man under Louisa's guidance, learning both Apache warrior skills from his father and medical knowledge from his white mother. He became a bridge himself, able to move between worlds. Desba and Nalin became sisters in purpose, teaching Louisa Apache culture while learning from her the science of healing. Years passed, measured in seasons of drought and rain. The territorial conflicts continued, but Goshevan's band remained largely at peace, protected by their unusual arrangement. By the white healer who had become genuinely Apache in all but blood, Louisa never returned to Philadelphia. Letters from her father eventually stopped coming. In the eyes of her former world, she had died or been captured. Only a handful of people knew the truth, that she had found something in the desert far more valuable than social approval. She had found purpose, had found a people who needed her skills desperately. On the 10th anniversary of the day, she had pulled Taza from the desert and sucked poison from his wound. Louisa stood on a ridge overlooking the camp. She was no longer young, her hair showing threads of gray, her hands bearing the scars of a decade of frontier medicine. But she was also no longer the uncertain woman who had fled Philadelphia seeking freedom. Goshevan joined her on the ridge. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the camp below where children played and warriors prepared for hunts. "Do you regret?" he asked finally. "Do you wish you had chosen different path?" Louisa considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she had abandoned, the comfort and security of civilization. Then she thought about the lives she had saved, the children who had survived because she was there, the women who had survived childbirth against all odds. She thought about Taza, now a young man who embodied the best of both worlds. "No regrets," she said finally. "I came west, looking for freedom to practice medicine on my own terms. I found that and so much more. I found family, purpose, belonging. I found that healing transcends politics and race. I found my home, Goshevan nodded. Good, he said. Because you are stuck with us now. They stood together as the sun set, a war chief and a healer. An Apache warrior and a white woman, a husband and wife joined not by romance, but by something stronger, by shared purpose and mutual respect forged in the crucible of frontier survival. Their story would never be told in history books. But in a small corner of the desert, among a people fighting for their existence, it mattered. It had changed lives, had prevented deaths, had built a fragile bridge between worlds at war. And sometimes, in the end, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.